I'm so thrilled to have on the podcast today someone who can finally explain to me what's going on with these tariff wars that have been going on. We have Lori Wallach, who is the director of Rethink Trade at American Economic Liberties Project and is senior advisor to the Citizens Trade Campaign. She comes highly recommended to explain these issues through a labor populist lens, which is the kind of lens that we like to hear about here on this podcast. So welcome to Bad Faith, Lori.
Thank you very much for including me.
No, it really is my pleasure. We're talking on April 2nd, which Donald Trump has labeled Liberation Day, and is a day, as I understand it, where he's planning to announce a suite of new tariffs as part of what has been sort of characterized as an ongoing tariff war, ratcheting up tensions with people who have historically been, countries that have historically been our allies, Canada and Mexico. Now, the overarching sort of tenor from the mainstream liberal press about any tariffs coming from Donald Trump, even prior to coming into office, was that they were default negative. I was really interested to talk to you because, at least in an interview prior to Trump coming into office, you were making the case that not all tariffs are bad. And in fact, you have been historically a critic of NAFTA and TPP, the kinds of economic agreements that have historically disenfranchised American workers. So I want you to help us untangle how we on the left should be thinking about tariffs broadly and tariffs as they're specifically being deployed by Donald Trump.
So Donald Trump has done the master class of how not to use tariffs. But the reality is tariffs are a totally legitimate tool. And if you are, for instance, a climate activist who has been fighting for what are called CBAMs, carbon border adjustment mechanisms, or you are someone who is a union activist and you want to have labor standards that are enforceable in trade agreements, you're for tariffs, like it or not. They basically are the enforcement tool in trade that is basically dependent on what you're aiming it for. What is your goal is much more important than what is the tool in this instance. But because it's Donald Trump, and because we've all had bashed into our heads since the first time in high school in an economics or political science course, your teacher said tariffs, Satan's spawn, cause death and destruction. We have this default notion that tariffs are bad, yet they've been used by every country, including the United States, for instance, to keep out unfair products that are made with forced labor. But again, to do things we as progressives would be totally for. You need a tariff.
Okay, so it's interesting to me because when you learned about tariffs in an economics class in high school or college, I have to confess, I never took an economics class in high school and college, and I don't want to be too pedantic, but let's just go there. What does it mean when we're talking about putting tariffs on various products in various countries? What are we actually talking about? And what are the typical effects that you see from the perspective of a consumer and also on the economy, broadly speaking?
So a tariff is a charge that's put on a product when it crosses the border. And the goal of a tariff is to raise the wholesale price. So their tariffs are used for different purposes, but a really common one is, for instance, if there's a particular known instance of a country abusing trade, so they are cracking up unions and keeping wages low intentionally as their economic strategy, a low road strategy to get investment, for instance, in Mexico, or they are doing massive subsidies from soup to nuts to make it impossible for even the hardest working, smartest company in another country to possibly compete. Or they're devaluing their currency. Because when something comes across the border, it's denominated in the local currency. When it gets switched into dollars, if you've devalued the value of your currency, you make it unnaturally cheap when it comes into the other market. So countries use what are often called the beggar thy neighbor trade abuse policies. You use a tariff to counter that. And so, for instance, what does it mean for the consumer? Totally depends on the company. So a company, in the face of a tariff on a product that uses forced labor or is, being sanctioned for being abusive of subsidies, the company decides, Walmart decides, Am I going to keep importing from, say, China, where a lot of those kind of policies are used? It's how China now has an enormous surplus in trade. It sells way more stuff than it buys from the whole world. So at this point, like, it's not just the US that has tariffs with China, Mexico, Indonesia, South Africa, like major industrializing developing countries are also getting flattened by this kind of cheating. So the tariff basically says to the Walmart, hey, you buy it from China, the price you pay Walmart, the wholesale price, which like for a t-shirt that they're going to sell for $5 is 5 cents, or for a fancy brand name tennis shoe that they're going to sell for $100 is $20. You are going to have a charge if you decide, your choice, to continue to buy that thing that for one reason or another we're saying is not fair, and we're going to add a charge on it to make it more fair coming in. Now, Walmart, you can pick an import from another country that is not cheating, and you avoid the tariff. You can try and find a domestic supplier, and you avoid the tariff. But you, Walmart, if you decide to import the tariffed good, then your wholesale cost is going to go up. Now, to put this in perspective of what it means to the consumer, because there's been a ton of misinformation about this. You take the $5 t-shirt from a Walmart that comes in and literally it's 5 cents, it's 10 cents, it's like nothing. So you decide a 25% tariff on that means, and I'm going to just do a number that's easier. I'm going to make it $8, so it's easier to add the what they're selling it for, and I'm going to make it that it comes in at 8 cents, so it's easy to do the math. You're adding 2 pennies to it, basically. So you come in, and it's like, all right, the markup is still ginormous, and Walmart can choose to take out of that enormous profit markup the cost of the wholesale tariff price increase. And that is what happened, FYI, because we've lived through this. Donald Trump won, put on average 20% tariffs on $350 billion with a B dollars of stuff coming from China when he was in office the first time. Did we see inflation spur in 2018 and 2019? No, we did not, actually. It was COVID. It was middle of 2020 before we saw inflation jump. Did we see suddenly the stuff that we buy every day have the prices go up? No, we did not. And by the way, there's a big study that actually goes sector by sector and shows in very few sectors were those prices passed on. Instead, what happened is some of these companies said, all right, I'm going to bring it in from X or Y other country and avoid the tariffs. That's exactly the kind of signal you want to send if you're trying to counter the bad behavior, because then the goal is the country that is doing the thing, be it environmental dumping or busting unions or whatever it is, says, if I continue to do this thing, all of these purchasers, both of stuff to sell at retail, but also what are called intermediate supplies, so the car part that's going to be assembled in a plant in the US, they're going to look for a version of that where they don't have to pay that tariff because they, the final seller, wants to have the biggest profit. So the tariff is used, again, a charge on a good crossing the border to send a price signal at the wholesale of basically go someplace else. That's to the intermediate buyer, the wholesale buyer, which is sending a signal to the producer of knock it off, start controlling your carbon emissions, stop busting the unions. And then a lot of decisions get made. Now, I just want to loop around and say a big problem is we have so much corporate concentration that where there isn't competition, companies can use the excuse of tariffs to price gouge. And some of the examples we all heard during the original Trump tariffs is just that. It's not really prices going up because of tariffs. So like everyone who has, looked at a podcast, been on social media, or watched cable news has heard that Trump's tariffs raised the prices of washers and dryers in the first term. And he did put tariffs on washing machines. Here's the thing, though. There were no tariffs on dryers. The companies, because there's so much concentration in that sector, basically a few companies are producing all the brands. They have different names on them, but the producers really have cornered the market. They just raised prices on dryers because there were tariffs on washers. And they thought they'd damn get away with it. And the news helped them by saying that's what evil tariffs did. And then even on washing machines, prices went up on washing machines in Canada. Canada had no tariffs. So they were just using the hysteria in the North American media market, tariffs, to actually get away with price gouging. And that's a really serious problem. So when today Trump announces more tariffs, it's going to be a disaster if he doesn't simultaneously crack down on price gouging.
So you're saying two things that I think are really important. One, that the wholesalers have the capacity and oftentimes historically do eat the cost of tariffs, eat the tax basically, and not pass it on to the consumer. But secondly, when there is the sort of consolidation that antitrust is so concerned with, they don't have to do that because there's no competition and they can blame the tariffs on the rising prices. And we saw a similar dynamic, not because of tariffs, but with things like egg prices and such in the context of the pandemic, where the pandemic and supply chain issues or avian flu or whatever it was blamed on these surges in prices, with the manufacturers or whoever it is, the sellers saying it's not my fault. This is all acts of God out of my hands, whether it's tariffs or pandemics that are causing the price gouging, basically. So if that is true, and if tariffs can have a beneficial purpose in incentivizing purchasing goods from countries where there are not labor violations or environmental problems and those sorts of things, what is the problem fundamentally with Trump's tariffs? What is driving, let's say, Trump's increasing tariffs on China in particular? Is it that Trump woke up one day and decided, yes, I'm very, very concerned about Chinese emissions? Am I very, very concerned about Chinese labor practices? Or is something else going on?
Well, let me step back and talk about another use of tariffs, because, the first thing I say when I'm speaking to a progressive audience is, friends, we use them too. And I remind people that President Biden basically tripled the tariff levels on imported EVs from China, on, the kind of fancy modern energy capacity batteries that you put in EVs, but that could be also storage in a bigger scale for wind or other kind of renewable energy, on solar panels, on things that were part of his industrial policy. He had 100% tariffs compared to like Trump's, which were much lower. And we think about tariffs and the use of those very targeted uses, which have been going on forever. And, not that this to me is the sign of, kosherness, but the WTO even allows the use of tariffs like that. The other use of tariffs, though, and what is the theory of the case behind Trump, is a use for what is called trade rebalancing. And so I want to step back, and just for your audience to sort of get the context of this, because typically, 99.9% of everything Trump says or does is both wrong and probably evil. On this one, he's actually right. And I want to just point out that when I came up in trade world as a recovering trade attorney in the early 90s, it was the Democrats who were saying this. He has stolen this agenda. And it was a certain independent House member, then Congressman Bernie Sanders, very lonely with a few others, David Bonnier, Rosa DeLauro, who were saying, friends, we can't have this consistent trade deficit.
It is becoming increasingly difficult to buy a product manufactured in the United States of America. How are we going to create jobs for our kids if we don't have a manufacturing sector? And I very much agree with that sentiment. Mr. President, we have got to stop giving large, profitable corporations tax breaks for shipping jobs overseas and start giving immediate tax relief to businesses who bring jobs back to the United States.
Because here's the thing. Economic theory predicts if you have a very large, persistent imbalance in trade. So what's a trade deficit? We import a ton more stuff than we export. And so the U.S. has had a chronic trade deficit every single year since 1975. And I hope you ask me why that is, because there's some very particular reasons for that. However, what the prediction of economics is when you are basically not making very much of the stuff you're consuming and you are buying it elsewhere, and then you're buying it, sending all those dollars out to other countries making your stuff, then they invest those dollars. They have to come back. That's the balance. They come back and they have to invest. They invest in the stock market, in luxury real estate, taking regular housing stock out of the market to be like the third or fourth apartment you have as an investment that's often empty. Debt, so U.S. Treasury bonds, et cetera, private sector bonds for companies, you end up having a return that goes to capital. And the result is you simultaneously deindustrialize. You can't sustain your own factories. You have this flood of imports crushing your own production. Again, a bunch of them subsidized, taking advantage of suppressed wages, taking advantage of unfairly devalued currencies. So it's not even kosher competition. You're just getting squash-elated. And then in addition, you have basically deindustrialization, but increased income inequality. That is a prediction of a persistent large trade deficit because the return is going to all of those capital-oriented market financialization venues of the dollars coming back in, and wages are getting pushed down because, number one, we're not making stuff in the industrial sector that was heavily unionized, et cetera, but where wages are higher for the 2/3 of Americans who don't have a college degree to have a job in manufacturing paid more than a job in services. And so we've seen in this country this horrible chronic imbalance gut major parts of the country. And it's not the rumor, it's just the Rust Belt. Not that one should say just the Rust Belt. It's California, it's Texas, it's New York. It's basically all of what you could call a factory town. These were places where very smart, very hardworking people who did not happen to have a college degree had a middle-class income. And communities were supported by the tax bases of those companies and those decent wages. And unions helped make sure the return was a share into wages, not just stock buybacks and profits. And you saw a much more equal and frankly, much more peaceable country compared to today, where if you don't have a college degree, you're going to live on average 8 years shorter lives. Like that is scandalous. You are going to, and our overall life expectancy is going down, not because of really old people dying faster, because working age people under the age of 60 of all races and colors and creeds who are non-college educated, dying of deaths of despair related to marginalization, which is also fueling this rage and political polarization in our country. So we have the story of having done ourselves in by having these chronic imbalances, and tariffs are one of the things you can use to force a rebalance. And I can explain the different methodologies of how you do that, but that is the theory of the case of reindustrializing. He's not so much thinking about the people as he's thinking about how do we get that production back. For, Donald Trump, they're also just thinking about the national security part of it. I am obsessed about the people I went to high school with in Wausau, Wisconsin, who at that point in the 70s had the standard of living that was very similar. If you had a parent in a union job in one of those manufacturing facilities, that was very similar to what your high school friend who's had a parent who was a doctor or a lawyer or whatever. It was in the realm. And that vision of a more rebalanced trade is why we should all think back to Congressman Bernie Sanders and all the other progressive Democrats who said, we can't have this trade imbalance. We're going to cause a catastrophe. And it's kind of come to pass.
The predictions being what they were, and Bernie Sanders and the others you mentioned ringing the alarm bell all those decades ago, why hasn't been the case that those warnings weren't heeded, especially as the warnings started to come to fruition? It seems like, I think I was reading this recently on Matt Stoller's Substack, that people saw this happening and the neoliberal political cohort said, it's fine, it's good, get over it. You can't be an industrial powerhouse forever. It's going to be a service economy. There's going to be benefits at the top, and I guess they'll trickle down to the rest of us in a way that sort of sounds like the rhetoric we're getting now about how AI is going to, it's going to be fine. It's going to free us all up. We're going to have, you're not going to have to work anymore, and just trust that all the benefits of this are going to trickle down to you when you no longer are employable. I mean, people were just making this argument, it sounds like, without any real mechanism or real accounting for how the populations that used to be buoyed by manufacturing were going to be able to persist.
I would call it faith-based economics with a major overtone of greed-fueled, willing knowledge that this financialization of our economy, where the major thing we produce now is dollar-denominated assets, not the stuff we need to have resilience, as we all saw during COVID, where we could not get the basic damn stuff that we needed to keep our families safe and happy, where we don't have diverse import sources, where we have basically hyper-globalized under these rules we are all told we're natural, we're the way forward, we're inevitable, which has resulted in too much stuff being produced by too few companies in too few places, so that when you have the inevitable pandemic, now the climate-fueled weather disaster, the earthquake that is always going to happen somewhere, you have no resilience. And it's not just we should be making all of it. That's not the point. For key things we need, medicine, communications equipment, energy equipment, things, basic infrastructure stuff, steel, aluminum, we need to make some. But also part of the use of tariffs and rebalancing trade is to diversify the places we also import stuff. And it's both a matter of justice for the people who will make some of that stuff here again. But honestly, it's an issue also of resilience, of basically fairness combined with security. Because even if you're not going to be the person making it, you need the access more reliably to these things as we go forward into a foreseeably, we can't have all the stuff made in any country. Like skip, it's China, which has another level of, is that a good idea? But any country, you can't have single source as we saw during COVID. So this imbalance issue, people sold it as if it was inevitable. I was in those fights during NAFTA and WTO. It was extremely painful. Anyone who brought up, not nitwits like Keynes and pointed out like, hello, the UK went through the thing we're about to do to ourselves in the interwar period. The US dollar has become, there have been choices that were made after World War II with the so-called Bretton Woods institutions. What was then the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, became the World Trade Organization, kind of a corporate hijack, subject of a different podcast, but an interesting one, written a book on that literally. But you have the WTO, you have the International Monetary Fund, you have the World Bank, and they had this set of roles at the end of World War II. And the US made certain decisions that, for instance, the dollar would end up as the global reserve currency. So what that means is, unlike other currencies where, like, if you have a huge trade deficit, your currency devalues. There's a natural market correction. But we're the global reserve currency, so we don't control the value of the dollar. Other countries hold dollar reserves because that's what they need to trade in, and or they do it to manipulate. So, China has reserves of dollars many times more than their balance of payment needs. That keeps the value of the dollar up, so it makes our trade uncompetitive. And relatively speaking, it brings down the value of the Chinese currency. A bunch of other countries do that intentionally. Germany has the benefit of, for instance, having trade currency manipulation without doing it because they're trading in euros, not in a Deutschmark that actually reflects the strength of their economy. So they, who have a huge trade surplus with the world, have that in part because they basically have a devalued currency they're trading in. So at this point, there are 19 countries in the world that have ginormous, persistent trade surpluses. They are using what are sometimes called beggar thy neighbor policies, a combination, typically, of subsidies, suppressing wages or suppressing consumption. Germany, it's suppressing consumption more than suppressing wages. And this is done, by the way, through tax policies, through other interventions. And they also, these countries typically have some currency benefit they create. You know, Korea buys a lot of dollars and brings down the value of their currency and pushes up the dollar, but also pushes up other currencies by intervening in the markets. 19 countries have a trade deficit with the world. Have a trade surplus with the world. 66 countries now have global deficits. The US has the largest honking one by far. But at this point, we have a global imbalance where if this were not Donald Trump, but this were President Bernie Sanders, he would sit down with the 66 countries who are also in this deindustrialized, more income inequality quagmire of what a chronic trade deficit does to you. He would get with the 100 countries that have, relatively speaking, balanced trade. And then he would say, y'all, we need to get together. And with those 19 countries that are basically abusing trade rules to make it impossible for the world to get the benefits of trade, because there are benefits. But if the system doesn't clear, if the system doesn't actually work and is imbalanced and you're getting the benefits, but you have a block of countries basically squashing everyone else, you are going to have the mess that we have now. And so the countries, if you were trade representative under President Bernie Sanders, you would get with all those other countries and then say to all 19 of those countries that are the surplus countries, say, y'all, here are your options. You guys can either knock it the hell off, and you've got 6 months to show us you're doing it, or we are all together putting up a 60% tariff against all of your all stuff. And you guys are just going to have to consume more of what you produce. You will not be dumping that in the rest of the world. Good, it will be good for your workers. You want to accumulate that wealth and that power doing that as the governments. Time's up. Your own workers are going to have to start consuming the stuff, and it's good for them that they are not now able to afford. The wages in China will go up. Germany, you're going to have to work on your tax policies there because you're not going to dump all that stuff on the rest of the world. That would be a way to rebalance trade. And the problem of what Trump is doing is his use of the tariff tool is so chaotic, so following a different goal every hour of every day, that totally logic vision of what you would do with the tariff and why you need to rebalance trade is like in a different time zone from what they're actually doing.
Okay. So what is motivating Donald Trump to the best you can figure it out? If it's not rebalancing trade, what is it?
I think part of it is rebalancing trade. And part of it is rebalancing trade on a vision that is not that actual accurate logical one I just laid out, but rather is this sort of peculiar victimization. I say peculiar because the U.S. government and U.S. multinational corporations had a big hand in writing the current rules. So, were they screwing most Americans when they were doing it? Did they get away with it? Selling what you called the neoliberal myth? They sure did. But, part of Trump's thing is everyone's treating us badly. And the way to really think about it is a bunch of, Wall Street and London City and, German financial gurus, plus the big multinational manufacturers from numerous countries, plus big pharma from numerous places. They all enjoyed the benefits of that system that was basically rigged against workers and consumers. But it's this victimization theory that then has Trump thinking of tariffs as like a tool to beat on countries because they are hurting us or attacking us or it's unfair. And I mean, obviously, some countries, the ones that are using these beggar thy neighbor policies are not just us, but the whole damn world. They are intentionally trying to favor themselves at the loss and damage of everyone else by using these unfair trade practices. But so Trump's sort of victimization thing means you do, and personal also, like, I don't like so-and-so, let's tariff them. It's like, I think the man was obsessed with like Justin Trudeau's socks or something. He just hated the socks. Like, why would you go after Canada? Like, hello, we have a trade surplus with Canada. I mean, there's an artifact of what looks like a deficit, but that's because Canadian crude oil for decades has been processed in refineries in like Detroit and in other parts of the northern tier of states for use and sale as gasoline in the northern part of the country. And so if you take out the crude oil, we have a damn trade surplus with Canada. We have a not small one in manufacturing. So like, why would you go after Canada? But they left out in their first tranche of tariffs countries with whom the United States actually has real, like unfair trade imbalances, like Vietnam or Japan or Korea or Germany. But they went after Canada. So it's that sort of victimization. I will use a tariff just to beat on people, you know, threatening Denmark over Greenland lust with tariffs. Hello, if you want to rebalance trade, like focus on where the trade imbalances are. If you want to actually boost manufacturing, because this is the other thing, you can't just do the tariffs. You got to do a set of other policies to actually make it do the thing. So the Biden administration got the highest rate of factory construction in 30 years by combining extra high tariffs to keep out the cheating stuff. So you have some chance of actually being able to have fairness in your domestic market with tax credits that generated demand for domestic stuff. You buy a domestic EV, you get this tax credit. Your solar credit is bigger if you buy equipment from the US, plus generating demand from the government. So you boost buy local, buy American, buy whatever state. And so the government also wants American-made stuff. And then on the investment side, you use different incentives, low interest loans, loan guarantees, some basically subsidies targeted to get the construction going. You want to signal to the private sector, hey, this is going to be an auspicious sector to invest in. If you make domestic EVs, we got the whole package here that gives you an opportunity to get a return on your investment. In fact, right now, you couldn't compete against a Chinese EV, but we're going to do the tariffs here. We're going to do demand over there. We're going to help you with a basically investment tax credit. Knock yourself out. You can make money doing this thing we need you to do. You put that whole package together, sometimes called industrial policy. Tariffs are a critical part of it, and you get the outcomes. You just do the tariffs, who knows what you're going to get? Because you do have protection, but like, is the company that already has a dominant position going to enjoy the protection and then do more stock buybacks? Or just like give out ginormous dividends? Like if you don't do the rest of the package to actually get the outcomes, and then you need to accompany that with new domestic policies. So like you need the PRO Act. You need to make it easier to join a union. So folks in those protected industries can say, hey, this is not just going to the investors. We're going to get better wages, and we're organized as a union to do it. And if you don't do that, your benefit here under protection is going to have a heart attack because we're going to have a strike. Or do you make sure there's anti-price gouging? Enforcement. Now, there are things you can do right now under the what is called the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, where Lena Khan was running the show until recently. They're under their statute right now, they have the authority to surveil prices. They can actually require companies to tell them what they're up to. And I just looking at my statute here, it's section 6B for all of you who want to follow along at home. You can pull it up on Google and take a look. It's a right to surveil corporate prices. And then there is a fair and anti-deceptive practices statutory authority that if they're price gouging, if they're raising the retail, that's what is price gouging? Raising the retail price above what their actual increased expense is. So if we go back to that t-shirt, if they go, if the price ends up, and sadly companies will do this, we're sorry, in anticipation of tariffs, our $5 t-shirt's not going to be $10. And then you realize like, wait, the actual tariff charged on that was 4 cents. So the reason they're doing that's price gouging. And so you have to actually act on all of those other pieces to have the tariff tool translate into the outcomes I think progressives would support. But again, you ask, what the hell with Trump? None of that is being organized. And then the final thing is, you got to be consistent. So the whole point of a tariff is you're sending an economic signal. You're saying, hey, you do this thing and you're going to make money here, Mr. Private Investor. Put your money here, build a factory. But if you have a tariff at 8 a.m., you have a half a tariff at noon, you have no tariff at 6 p.m., and maybe at midnight, you have the tariff back. That kind of roller coaster is much more likely to have like investors in a future U.S. factory, like reach for a barf bag than their checkbook. That actually is guaranteed not to have the signaling turn into new manufacturing. And that's another thing that Trump has been doing. So wrong target, goals, what is he doing it for? Beating up, or actually wrong mix of policies, wrong countries, inconsistent means like exactly how not to use a tariff.
I heard you speak to this idea that one of Trump's rationale with respect to Mexico is that he's trying to prevent drugs coming across the border. This is a sort of an anti-fentanyl policy. But again, even that, version, that rationale is undercut by, again, the failure to implement policies that actually target where most fentanyl comes across the border. Is that right?
So the hitch there is, unfortunately, as the border intervention of actual drug smugglers has increased, one of the ways that traffickers have started to try and get particularly fentanyl-laced pills, but also the precursors into the U.S. is to use a trade loophole that is called the de minimis entry. And what that means, to translate it back, is, how you come in from a vacation that maybe had you overseas, and you get that form that says, do you have more than $200 worth of stuff you're bringing back? So if it's $200 or less on the plane, or by shipment, $800 or less, every U.S. resident can import every day that much stuff going around normal customs forms. So you're not sitting there in the airport figuring out what the tariff code is of the knickknack that you bought. You don't have to pay tariffs. You don't have to pay taxes, and the stuff isn't inspected. So that loophole was relatively small. And then in 1995, they made a little twist to it that basically said the importer of record, who counts for the $800 or $200, is me, the consumer. It's not the company importing it. That exploded e-commerce. So the big e-commerce platforms like Shein, Temu, the ones who are being accused of using forced labor, those guys can bring in endless amounts of stuff that totally skirts Trump's tariffs, any kind of tariff, cheating tariffs, normal tariffs, because $800 a day is accrued to me. So you would think first thing in the morning, Amazon shut down. They sent out 2 mailings and they've hit $800.
Yeah.
That's because you have the count, I have the count. So we now have, brace yourself, 4 million online small value packages coming in as this tax-free workaround. It doesn't get inspected. 4 million every day. This is from when this got opened, it's gone from, 50,000 a year to 4 million every day. The result is the traffickers realize in that avalanche of, fast fashion and whatever, they can just bury this illegal stuff because none of it's getting inspected. And so you hear these horrible stories of people buying what they think is a generic online of a muscle relaxer, a sleeping pill, something they've been prescribed, but they don't have time to go to the pharmacy, or the pharmacy wants to charge too much. And then they take the pill and they never wake up, and it turns out to be fentanyl poisoning. That stuff, that epidemic of those kind of deaths, that's a de minimis problem. And now the actual commercial smugglers are using that as a way to bring in the chemicals that are precursors to the drugs from China, which is mainly where they are made. Because if it's on a ship and it's coming in through normal trade, you have to list everything in detail with lots of technical codes. It's a lot easier to try and figure out what is not okay that's coming in, and the stuff gets inspected. But this de minimis thing. So the cynicism of Trump announcing that his tariffs were supposed to be stopping fentanyl when he has the existing authority at this moment to close that loophole that really is a significant source and growing source of both the precursor chemicals, but also the pills that are killing people, is like the height of rottenness. And here's what's even worse. When he first did those tariffs on February 1 on Mexico, Canada, and China, he closed the loophole. He met with the FedEx CEO 4 days later. FedEx delivers those packages. They make a ton of money on this loophole, and he reversed it. And it stayed open ever since. It has stayed open ever since.
All right. Okay. So it's sounding like Trump is a bad faith actor. I want to ask you, though, Sean Fain of the UAW gave a statement on how he feels about the tariffs. He recently said, "We applaud the Trump administration for stepping up to end the free trade disaster that has devastated working class communities for decades." What do you make of what seems like sometimes qualified, but sometimes relatively unqualified union support for the tariffs more broadly? Are there good things that we should be celebrating here that Trump is doing?
Absolutely. So the UAW sort of theory of the case, which by the way is mine. You asked me all the things that Trump is messing up. I'm not attacking the use of these tariffs overall. I want to see, it's an experiment to see what they're going to do. They could get it right. There are some people in this administration that, despite the president's chaos and lack of focus and wrong thinking about the cause of the problem, theoretically, they could actually target some of the right things. They did do some very smart things with tariffs in the first term, despite Trump, because his advisors knew how to do it. So what the UAW is saying is, hey, we have had decades of devastating trade policy. I mean, just since the early 90s, when the NAFTA, the World Trade Organization, China joining the trade organization, all that neoliberal lollapalooza that Congress approved, we have lost 90,000 U.S. factories. We have lost net 6 to 7 million manufacturing jobs. If you drive into the non-urban parts of almost any state where there were middle-sized towns that had manufacturing, you can see the devastation that is that economic statistic I was talking about of economic inequality. So we have seen the results, and the unions are basically saying, hey, we have got to do something about these unfair imports from those 19 countries that are systematically breaking the rules and cheating. We will never be able to have the ability to make things here in the union factories we want to organize, to have the resilience and stability for Americans to know we make some of those key things here, but also in other countries around the world that are also getting squashed by those unfair imports, they will make it. So if our system goes down, we have another place to import it. That's just not one source. That whole vision involves using tariffs, as I said, to rebalance. Now, will Trump do it right? It has not looked auspicious. But what the unions are saying is this old system has destroyed our working class, really, opportunities for good jobs, to make the things America needs, to stay healthy, to stay happy, and to stay safe. And so what they're saying is, yes, thank goodness people are using tariffs in the same way they celebrated 100% tariffs that Biden did. And in fact, a lot of Democrats celebrated those Biden tariffs, which, more strategic, had the rest of the package. But it is a huge policy mistake and an even bigger political mistake for Democrats to just attack tariffs. I mean, it's super tempting, right? There's been enormous chaos the way Trump has used them. So, we definitely should attack the Trump non-strategic, unsuccessful, chaotic use of tariffs. But to attack tariffs overall is basically, as Congressman Chris DeLuzio said in the New York Times op-ed a couple weeks ago, if we say we're against all tariffs, we're saying we're okay with a system that basically doesn't have a route for working class Americans to make the things in this country being paid a decent wage with decent environmental and health standards or people in other parts of the world who want to raise wages and who want to actually, in countries, raise environmental standards to be able to compete against those 19 countries that are doing the squash everyone else standard. And so we should be thinking about how to smartly use tariffs. Again, that may not be what Trump's going to do, but just going against them all in all is a losing maneuver. And so the unions are basically saying, hey, we've had 40 years of being killed by this old trade system. Yeah, we do need to break all the furniture. And the first thing we need to do is stop these unfair imports. So that's why they're celebrating it. And they are not wrong. I have just written a bunch of articles folks can see, like in the American Prospect, folks can see in Project Syndicate, where I lay out, here's how you use tariffs. Here's why we should be for tariffs when they are used in a smart way. We're going to need them in the future, even if Donald Trump is totally screwing it up right now. And we don't know what will happen today. It could be that the actual tariffs that they announced today could be, some of them, smart. We don't know yet. But certainly the first 2 months of tariff use has not been auspicious.
I want to ask something that's been on my mind. There's this idea that, we're at the end of a failing empire and China's descendants, and that causes a lot of anxiety for people for various reasons. It might just be the way things are going. And there is all kind of sort of saber rattling that gets deployed with the, on the basis that we have to do this to protect this upcoming war with China, including actual sort of like military escalation, saber rattling, but also with respect to some of these trade battles. And there's a way that I observe, labor practices in China or emission standards in China being used as a rationale for, let's say, a trade war with China, when sometimes it does just feel like protectionist. And I know, I don't want to be like the left gets criticized for being like overly sanguine about China and like what the consequences of China's rise is going to be, and hating America and American empire so much that we're willing to like take the country regardless of the consequences. So I'm sensitive to that criticism. But let me just get to the point. If we really did care about the environment, let's say, isn't there an argument that says we should be happy to import cheap Chinese electric vehicles? Yes, it would be great if we made them domestically, but today we are not in a position to similarly make cheap EVs. That we are on the precipice, not on the precipice, we are knee deep in this environmental crisis, and exigency demands that we just all be quickly as possible converting to lower emissions vehicles. And if they're making solar panels cheaper, we should be buying them and putting them on our roofs ASAP. And yes, moving toward growing our own industrial capacity. But are we using these ideas like, a desire to grow the American workforce and make more things at home, the desire to not exploit low labor standards in China? Are we using those ideas really just to justify, a kind of brinksmanship with a country that ultimately is on an ascendant path while we're on a decline? Do you know what I'm sort of getting at? Okay.
Yeah. So, there are 4 important points about that question, particularly with like the solar, the EVs. But let me just say, the paths of various countries are not sort of an act of God. It has to do with policies and planning and strategy. And part of whatever the role of the U.S. is in the future, part of what you would hope the government is doing is thinking about how we have a country that can provide the stuff that people who live here need in a reliable way. And that we are basically, from a progressive perspective, we would say girding for the downsides that we can see of future climate chaos and doing everything we can to not make it worse. So part of the whole notion of what is the economy we need to meet our goals and what tools do we use to create it would be the progressive way, the industrial policy way, more the Biden-esque way of thinking about why we want to make this stuff here. Because number one, to get just directly to your question about the energy stuff, the way it's produced in China and in some other countries is not a net environmental plus. So it may be cheaper and it may be faster in the short term, but they are making it burning dirty coal. So the life cycle analysis of that solar panel, of that EV, even if you are feeling virtuous using it here, is you have done so much damage to the climate in the making of the cheaper thing on the other end, that life cycle wise, and there's a lot of analysis done about this very question in trying to figure out, do you sequence stuff in? Do you go right away? The White House was doing this during Biden. In the climate part of the White House, trying to do the math of like, should we let more of these dirty panels, dirty in the sense of the value of carbon emitted making them, was going to be more than you could possibly save in the 30-year life cycle of that thing on your roof or in an electric. So number one, life cycle analysis, it doesn't actually meet the goals. Number two, availability and reliability of source is a big deal. So as we saw during COVID, if one part of the world is the only place something is mainly being produced, and right now China is producing, for instance, 80% of residential solar. So if whatever happened, and they concentrate the areas where these, so in they call it Solar City, in the part of China where this is largely being done, if it went down, the implications are enormous of having it so concentrated with respect to, even if it wasn't net carbon net loss, you just wouldn't be able to get this stuff. So that's number two. Number three, you can't have a scenario where how you save the planet is you use Uyghur forced labor and basically have production based on torture and, vicious suppression of basic human rights. That is not a long-term, I'm not signing up for that, to have that in my house when we have another option. So yes, can you have people exploiting those arguments for pure protectionist reasons? That is true. Do we also know that, in fact, in Mexico, real independent labor unions are still getting squashed? It's somewhat better under their, NAFTA 2.0, but it's still a big honking problem, and that people are still being disappeared for standing up for their rights, and that is not okay. Yes, as a value, as progressives, we need to actually use our wallets to try and say, ixnay, that is not okay. There are international standards. Every human being should have those protections, and I'm not going to incentivize the opposite behavior. And then number four is, for thinking about the environmental stuff, if you think about how much carbon is emitted, schlepping heavy things from across the world, one of the most interesting analyses I've started to see out of Europe is what they call carbon miles. And they do it for food miles, they do it for product miles. And they're trying to figure out life cycle analysis. Like, does it make more sense to grow blah, blah in a solar heated greenhouse in a cold place, some thing you want to eat in the winter that you couldn't otherwise grow in, name your Scandinavian country, versus having it flown, because for a lot of fresh food, it's flown to make sure it stays edible from wherever in the global south, as compared to, if you step back and look at our, food trade policies. This will shock people, but right now the U.S. has gone into a food trade deficit. We export commodities. We export corn, wheat, and soy. And we are simultaneously one of the world's largest exporters of soy and a sizable importer of soy. So imagine the carbon implications of the grain traders making money on like soy in, soy out. Yet if we think about it and having not just the resilience of getting the stuff, but the cost of moving it from way far away, the reality is, in this carbon counting era, we're going to have more production distributed around the world. And so like if I had a magic wand, I would set up some higher standards. So put the international labor and environmental standards as a floor of decency. I would set up our region, North America and the Caribbean, we're one place you develop a high standards production capacity. And by the way, we want Central America and South America to be another one. And we want two of those in Europe. And we want to make sure the China bloc is operational, but then in other parts of Asia, so that when it comes to things that everyone is going to need, non-carbon energy production capacity, equipment, food, medicines, we have much more redundant production worldwide, entirely separate from the geopolitics. But thinking about the world we're going into, because of the climate crisis, we're going to need that just for resilience to make people safe and stable.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess what I am needling on is that so much of how I perceive trade conversations is like it's sort of a zero-sum game. And I guess what I'm trying to get at bottom with the way that China is sometimes framed in these conversations is that it feels like less like this world that you allude to wanting to make with the wave of a magic wand. If you were in charge, or if Bernie were in charge, where the goal is to, take those 16 countries that have a trade surplus and make us all sort of neutral, verge upon trade neutrality. But it feels more like we're trying to get into a trade surplus ourselves or advantage ourselves to the diminishment of another country in a third world. And the way that my understanding is that the IMF and the World Trade Organization have been keeping the global South economically depressed since time immemorial, since they were created. That was the purpose of their creation. And I guess I am trying to better understand, kind of which arguments I should be skeptical of because they seem like they're going to that end, a sort of just protectionist competitive end, and which are genuinely the sort of trade policies that are geared toward empowering domestic workforce, toward creating supply chain stability in emergencies, food security, all of those kinds of things. And if it is the case that the only party that's really talking about using tariffs in this moment are Republicans, and so much of the way that Donald Trump is deploying this tool is in bad faith, I want to be better equipped. I mean, and this is why we're having this whole conversation, but I do want to be well equipped to be able to discern, what are the good faith trade arguments being made, and not fall into this trap of being a Democrat saying trade is bad, but also not fall into the trap of basically applauding uncritically this sort of scattershot methodology that Trump seems to be using, and which is getting some pushback, I should say, from some Republicans, even though Donald Trump typically has a kind of like a lockdown on his party and is not very open to these kind of criticisms. I saw, what was this fellow's name? One congressmember in particular who was saying that there was some regret that Congress had basically given up so much authority to the executive to control trade policy, and that maybe they should start ratcheting back the power of the purse.
So it's super, I think the final word on this is you have identified how super confusing the cross currents are, because it's Donald Trump who's using the tool, and how he talks about and how he thinks about it is so different than how a President Bernie Sanders would use the tool, which I suspect he would use with the same level of experimental joy, I would put it, which is to use the tool in a way that there has been a bipartisan, neoliberal elite consensus of tariffs as antichrist, managing trade to have particular outcomes as dangerous and stupid, when in fact, tariffs are just a policy tool. Trade is just another mechanism that you use to achieve goals. And so when you see Republicans starting to actually criticize Trump, those are the most sort of pro-old neoliberal trade, Chamber of Commerce adjacent Republicans who are longing to go back to the old NAFTA, WTO, offshore everything, import, forced labor goods. They have a view which sadly would characterize where I would say, President Clinton was, President Obama was. That is this old vision you started out asking, how is it people bought that baloney for so long?
Yeah.
And you've got this shift that President Biden grabbed onto, that USTR Catherine Tai, who's been speaking about this use of tariffs by Trump, chaotic and likely to backfire. But should we, as progressives, have this tool in our toolkit? Should we this old system? Did the Biden people try to upend decades of that old system that some of these Republican senators with the Chamber of Commerce are starting to stick their heads up going, wait, we want to go back to the old way? And yes, the way that a progressive president would use tariffs versus the way Trump thinks about it, extremely different. But woe be the Democrat who is in any way associated with longing to go back to the stability of that system that has so dramatically failed working people, independent farmers, consumers. And, one thing to think about is when you were saying the IMF, the World Bank, the WTO have been designed to stick it to developing countries. One of the smartest things that was said to me at the time the WTO was hatched by a very prominent developing country, super progressive economist, he said, you just look, the WTO is structural adjustment for the North. This is corporate structural adjustment. Structural adjustment is the technical term of what the IMF and the World Bank did to developing countries, where they basically grabbed them by the neck and said, you want these loans? Privatize your education, cut your corporate taxes, crazy big intellectual property rules that make it impossible for, small farmers to get seeds or people to get medicine. And they just basically at the price of, we'll do your loan, but here's what you're going to have to do that was a structural adjustment program. And this person had the insight of saying, yeah, this corporate globalization, this version of basically corporate run hyper globalization that marginalizes working people, small farmers, consumers, and has this, the market will decide, allegedly, but is full of protections and privileges for certain interests. That, the way to think about that is basically multinational capital versus everyone else. And you northern countries who've had your social contracts and your FDR New Deal, you just look. You are going to get structurally adjusted through these trade agreements that have all these one-size-fits-all rules. You are going to get deindustrialized. You are going to have your future taken away and your democratic control taken away. And the reality is that very class-oriented corporations versus people's, capital versus working people analysis is actually 35 years later proved to be prescient of how those institutions did work. And so it's a little bit more of a big capital versus people as compared to North versus South, which certainly is how the Bretton Woods system may have started. But over time, it is really a kind of Bernie Sanders was right moment about how this has worked and why we need to bust it up.
It feels so bizarre. This is the last thing I'll say. I know I'm spinning my wheels a little, but it feels so bizarre to have watched Donald Trump effectively message on NAFTA was bad in 2016 and win, right? And Hillary Clinton standing there defending those trade policies. And for Bernie to have been popular and ascendant during that time, making the same argument on trade as Donald Trump, more or less, in broad strokes. And for the Democrats to have lost then, to see him make some of those same moves in 2024 and win, and to still have Democrats not understand that that's a losing rhetorical battle. But is this one of those issues where it's not that Democrats are stupid, but they're being paid to misunderstand the moment, that they're still under the influence of whatever, scions of global capital that are funding their campaigns, that they are unwilling to divest themselves from this policy that the American people clearly don't want.
So here's what's happened. Over time, the Democrats have consistently been onto this and been more representative of what the public wants. Like the vote on NAFTA in 1993, majority of Democrats against, majority of Republicans for. And it's been that way ever since. I would say what's happened is the anti-Trump revulsion has basically shifted. By the way, there have always been Democrats, many of them in the White House prior to Biden, who were exactly what you just described, which is they were part of the problem. They were in with that very set of powerful elite financial institutions. Democrats more Wall Street oriented, typically the Republicans more agribusiness and, multinational manufacturing oriented. But either way, like it was in their political economic interest to do this position that was against most working people. But at this point, the Democrats still are much more, have been congressional Democrats on the right place. So take them away from the presidential class of Democrats, have been in the right place on these issues. But what's happened now, and this is why it's so confusing, and you have a bunch of Democrats who've always been pro-trade justice, have fought against the Trans-Pacific Partnership, et cetera, who now are seeing it's Donald Trump saying the things they used to say, literally words out of their mouths, and they can't bear the idea of being on the same side of Trump in any shape or form. And they're starting to say things that sound like the chamber dam commerce of, save NAFTA. And that's
I'd buy Trump derangement syndrome as the kind of rationale in this moment. But what do you make of Hillary Clinton, for instance? Do you see her as a Trump derangement syndrome person or a true believer back in those 2016 debates?
True believer.
Yeah.
True believer.
Yeah.
I mean, she wasn't credible when she flipped to being TPP. I heard her talk in favor of TPP. She was a believer. Believe me, she was a believer. She would have run in front of a train to save TPP right until she had to say she hated it because she was not going to get elected saying she liked it.
Yeah. Okay, this is fascinating. I'm going to let you go. I could have you here all day. This has been really illuminating.
I'm going to go run up to the Hill and talk to Democrat Congress people about some of these very same things, but I better split. But let's do it again. I love to talk about this stuff, as you might have noticed.
Thank you so much for joining us. And do you want to tell the audience before you go where they can find more of your writing and other work on the internet and beyond?
Please. So I direct a thing called Rethink Trade. It's a part of the American Economic Liberties Project. And you can find our website at www.rethinktrade.org. And there you can find a lot more materials about all of these issues, including some of my recent publications of basically how to understand tariffs as a progressive. And thank you so much for this really interesting conversation.
Fantastic. Thank you, Lori Wallach. Thank you to all the listeners. You can get an extra episode of Bad Faith Podcast every Monday at patreon.com/badfaith. And as always, take care of yourselves and keep the faith. Hey, YouTube. Thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.